Time to shatter their skies and bring down the steel rain. We're talking artillery in 9th edition. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're looking through the entirety of 9th edition 40k and talking about the most powerful ignores line of sight weaponry. We'll start by talking about why artillery is quite so important, and then talk through the major ignores line of sight options for each faction that has them, and finish up by saying which ones are my favourites. So to start off, ignores line of sight shooting is really quite important in games of 9th edition, and if your army does happen to have some efficient sources of it, then it can be a really good thing to include in a list. With obscuring terrain being a major feature of 9th edition battlefields, having some artillery means that you can put a little bit of firepower exactly where you need it, and stop your opponents from having the peace of mind of just parking a unit behind terrain and knowing that you can't hurt it. It can be quite nice to just help clear off an extra model or two off objectives, which can be really quite a big deal. You get to keep your unit safe while firing, as it doesn't have to be in line of sight itself, and it's just quite a nice flexible tool for a list. Either you can use it to help focus fire down the most important threat, or maybe plink the last few wounds off a damaged unit that you didn't have any other units that were in range of it. It means that even if the firepower isn't the most efficient point for points, it can still have a much greater impact than its raw numbers alone, just because you have the power to choose exactly where you want to put it on the battlefield, which isn't always the case for more direct line of sight shooting. In 8th edition, having very heavy artillery lists was kind of common, particularly after the second Space Marine Codex dropped. You could have entire lists of Thunderfires and Whirlwinds for the Imperial Fists, and Guard could provide entire artillery lists as well, with Basilisks, Manticores and Wyverns. In 9th edition, I think Games Workshop wised up to the fact that ignores line of sight shooting is really quite powerful, particularly in combination of line of sight blocking terrain, and they slapped a bit of a points bump on pretty much all of the artillery units. In general, that means in 9th edition that most of the units that ignore lines of sight, such as say Space Marine Whirlwinds or Guard Basilisks, aren't anywhere near as powerful in terms of points per damage compared with most units that just fire directly. In general, this means that the incentive is to make artillery an element of your list, but not to absolutely spam it for days, as then you just won't have the raw damage output to destroy the enemy army. Most damage dealers will be direct line of sight weapons, and then maybe just have a bit of artillery to use as a problem solving tool to be applied where you can get absolute maximum value out of it. In any case, let's talk through ignores line of sight shooting and go through the various armies in the game, starting with the Space Marines. So out of the core codex, the main two choices for Codex Space Marines are the Whirlwinds and the Thunderfire cannons. Whirlwinds are 125 points, or 135 if you give them Vengeance missiles. The Castellan missiles will be 2d6 shots at Strength 6, AP 0 and Damage 1, or the Vengeance ones 2d3 at Strength 7, AP-1 and Damage 2. To be honest, for the points, it's really mediocre damage. The Vengeance for 135 points is essentially the equivalent of 2 autocannons. Personally, I wouldn't take the Whirlwind for the damage output whatsoever. The only reason that I'd consider taking one in a competitive list would be for the 1 command point suppression fire stratagem. The unit that you targeted gets to fight last, can't overwatch, and also can't set to defend in ruins. The biggest deal out of those for me is usually going to be fights last. It means that say if you were charging 2 enemy units on different sides of the battlefield, you could make one fight last and then safely fight first with your other unit, knowing that the enemy can't interrupt you with counter-offensive. Can be really quite a great support piece for an otherwise melee army list. Sadly though, for most chapters, the damage output just really isn't worth it. One of the terrors of 8th edition, the Thunderfire cannon, got heavily nerfed in the transition to 9th. It went up to 120 points with the Tech Marine gunner, and its damage output was kind of shafted. You now get 43 shots at Ballistic Skill 2+, Strength 4, AP 0, Damage 1. Not really good for anything else other than dealing with a little bit of light infantry. It's more fragile than the Whirlwind with only 4 wounds, though I suppose you can have the Tech Marine go and do its own thing if the platform is destroyed. Again, like the Whirlwind, I'd say the main advantage is using Tremor Shells for 1 CP. If you target something that doesn't fly or isn't a Titanic unit, then that stratagem can halve their movement and -2 to advance and charge. Basically, you're paying the points for the Thunderfire cannon and the command point for the stratagem to really try and keep one enemy unit out of the game. Definitely powerful when it works, but it is kind of dependent on your opponent having a ground-pounding unit that really wants to be moving forward quickly. Most competitive Space Marine lists don't bother with either of these, but I think that used intelligently, they could be kind of worth it if you're willing to sacrifice the command points. From the Forge World Imperial Armor Compendium, we have the Whirlwind Scorpius, Sicaran Arcus tank, and the Rapier Quad Launcher. and the Whirlwind Scorpius is perhaps the best damage dealing Space Marine artillery piece. It's a bit more expensive than the other two at 170 points, and you do have to pay 1 command point for the Martial Legacy keyword, but for that price at least you get a gun that actually does something. 3d3 shots, strength 6, AP -2 and damage 2. Not too bad for chewing through things like standard Space Marines or maybe Gravis armored Marines. It's not absolutely stellar damage output, you are still paying a premium for it to ignore line of sight, but I think if you actually want to deal damage, it's far better than the standard Whirlwind or the Thunderfire. The Sicarian Arcus is an interesting alternative to it. It's 170 points, again and 1 command point, and for that you get 2d6, strength 6, AP -1, damage 2 shots that ignore line of sight, plus it's got a 14-inch move, 14 wounds, and also a heavy bolter to boot. It is a bit of a shame to lose that extra bit of AP, it does make it a lot less useful against Space Marines, but perhaps having the extra couple of wounds and the heavy bolter to plink away with might just about make up for it. Finally we have the Rapier Quad Mortar for 120 points. Sorry, I can't do maths and I wrote 110 here. It's basically a ballistic skill 3 Thunderfire cannon, but it does have the alternate fire mode of a 24-inch weapon with heavy 4, strength 8, AP -2 and damage 3. Out of the two, that direct fire mode is far better to be honest, though of course it doesn't ignore line of sight. Again, I don't think it's going to get taken all that much. To be useful you do want that direct firepower, but for the points it's really not that tough and quite easy to take out. For me, I'd say the Whirlwind, Thunderfire Cannon, the Scorpius and the Arcus are all potentially useful. Perhaps I'd say the best picks might be the Whirlwind and the Whirlwind Scorpius. Moving on to the Imperial Guard, and the Hammer of the Emperor are absolutely famed for their artillery fire support. If you take into account all the Forge World options, they have far more options than any other faction, and they have a truly standout option in the Manticore for 145 points. The Manticore gets 2d6 strength 10 AP -2 shots at damage d3, and most of the time it makes sense to upgrade them to the full payload tank case upgrade, which makes all of those shots a flat damage 3. You only get 4 shots over the game, but to be honest by turn 5 the game's usually decided anyway, so it's not really the biggest deal in 9th. You average around 2 dead marines or 4 to 5 wounds to a standard vehicle, and you can further augment its firepower with certain regiments such as Cadian, Catachan or a custom tank focused regiment. For the points, the full payload Manticore is one of the single strongest ignores line of sight units in the game. I'm afraid at the moment the Basilisk just isn't quite on the same level. It's 125 points, but you only get to roll 2d6 and pick the highest for the number of shots, which is usually going to mean between 4 or 5. Even with the reduced points, it just doesn't compete with the Manticore at an average of 7, and the AP doesn't quite make up for that against virtually any target. Out of the two, I think that the Manticore is the way to go at the moment. Then we have Wyverns and Mortar teams, both of which will put out a fair bit of strength 4 firepower. The Wyverns are 135 points, and the Mortar heavy weapon teams are 50 points for 3 bases. On average, the Mortars will do a little bit more damage and can get orders, but they are very fragile, and if your opponent manages to get shots on them, they will die to a stiff breeze. The Wyverns are tougher, faster, have some tank synergies with regiments, and they also get a heavy bolter to boot, but even with that reroll wound special rule, the Mortar teams will do more damage against most targets. Where these come into their own is against really big units of hordes. They're going to be incredibly efficient against anything like Orc boy mobs with over 11 models in them, where all of those blast weapons are going to be getting the full 6 shots. Overall, I think that they both have their merits, whether you want the extra resilience and mobility of the Wyvern, or the extra damage output of the Mortars. Just incidentally, if you're firing against things like Orc boys, on average per 100 points, the Mortars will get 4.3 dead Orcs, and the Wyverns a little bit less at 3.3. Guard have an absolute ton of ignores line of sight Forge World options, and if you'd be interested in seeing a bit more about them, I did make an entire video as to Guard Forge World artillery choices. Feel free to search that if you'd like. For the ones that really compete with the Codex choices though, my favourites are the Medusa and the Quad Launcher. The Medusa is 140 points and basically gets an ignores line of sight demolisher cannon at 36 inches. Against hard targets it even outshoots the full payload Manticore by a little bit, though it is significantly less good against 3 wound infantry or anything lighter like hordes. The Quad Launchers are potentially interesting alternative to the Wyverns and Mortar teams. It's 90 points for 46 strength 5 shots, and is kind of fairly equivalent to the Mortar teams, 4.3 dead Orcs per 100 points, but has the disadvantage of not being able to move, and is at least fairly fragile if it's targeted directly. There are many other Forge World options. You can take the Death Strike missile if you'd like to, though at the moment it's not very good. and guard lists can get a little bit of cheap ignores line of sight shooting in their infantry squads by scattering in a few mortars on objective campers. Can be potentially handy if they were just going to be hiding out of line of sight anyway. In general though, perhaps unsurprisingly, the Manticore definitely wins the guard section for me. It's just insanely powerful compared with other options. Not every Imperial army has access to ignores line of sight weapons, but some of the others that do are these. The Scorpius Disintegrator Cannon with the Belarus Energy Cannon is 150 points for the Adeptus Mechanicus, and it is quite a common pick in tournament armies for them. You get 3d3, Strength 6, AP-1, Damage 2 shots, which really is quite general purpose, and it is a bit more of a mixed role tank as you get a bunch of autocannon equivalent missiles to fire off and 6 shots from heavy stubbers. At least until the Admech Codex drops, it's got some incredibly powerful synergies, such as getting extra strength from the Mars Canticle of the Omnissiah, and you can also combine that with some hefty rerolls from units like Belisarius Core, the Tech Priest Dominus, or even exploding 6s to hit with one of the Warlord traits. I've seen quite a few tournament-winning Admech lists that pack a trio of these. For Imperial Knights, if you have the option to take Ironstorm missile pods, they're usually a good shout. 15 points for a D6 Strength 5, AP-1 and Damage 2 shots is pretty great. Knights in particular might struggle with little units hiding out of line of sight, so scattering these about on the big knights is a really good idea in my opinion. Finally, Grey Knights have the very cheeky Astral Aim Psychic power. It's Warp Charge 5, and you get to ignore line of sight and cover for a unit that's shooting. This can actually combine really nicely on a Venerable Dreadnought with las cannons and missile launchers, so you can potentially have an anti-tank sniper unit that can even fire if it's stuck behind a ruin in your own deployment zone. It might just be a little bit risky to do that though, as you might always fail the power. It also combines pretty nicely with a bunch of other Grey Knight units, Purgation squads for their slightly heavier weapons, maybe a big unit of Paladins using Cybolt ammunition for some potent Stormbolter fire, or perhaps even a Land Raider with las cannons, which I feel like might be one of the more interesting uses for actually getting a Land Raider to be used in the whole of Warhammer 40k. Quite intimidating to think that you've got 4 las cannons that could hit basically whatever they want. Moving on to the realm of Chaos now. Perhaps the 2 best options for the Chaos Space Marines are the Whirlwind Scorpius again, 170 points, and it can even potentially be a little bit more efficient than its Loyalist brother, as it can get rerolls from characters. Potentially could be quite strong in an Iron Warriors detachment, getting ignore cover, and a stratagem for +1 to wound when targeting vehicles. There's also the option of the Chaos Rapier battery as well, pretty much similar to the Loyalist one. For the Death Guard, of course, we have the Plague Burst Crawler for 175 points, which I think you'd want to pay for the Entropy Cannons if you were using it as a bit more of a backfield fire support unit. The Plague Burst Mortar itself gets D6 shots at Strength 8, AP-2 and Damage D3, and it is also a Plague weapon on top of that, so it'll reroll wound rolls of 1. You might be able to get an extra -1 toughness if its target has a Contagions of Nurgle unit nearby. There's various synergies with plague weapons throughout the book that it might be able to make use of, and the mortar does have its own stratagem in Disgusting Force, which makes the mortar shots damage 3 for a turn, and also any unit within 3 inches of its target take a mortal wound on the roll of a 4+. Could be nice in a pinch, particularly if fired against 3 wound infantry. For the points, the mortar damage isn't enormously overwhelming, but of course it isn't just that. You also get those 2 excellent entropy cannons with damage D3 plus 3, and also a heavy slugger on top of that as well as being monstrously tough, one of the toughest vehicles in the game. Maybe not just a dedicated artillery piece, but an all-round strong unit. Finally, Chaos Knights can also take Ironstorm pods, just like their Loyalist brothers. Moving to Xenos now, and the Eldar do have quite a lot of ignores line of sight weaponry. The Night Spinner for 145 points has at least a reasonably decent damage output, 2d6 shots at Strength 7, AP0 and Damage 2, but if you roll any 6s to wound, then it becomes AP-4 instead. That can make it at least fairly reliable with plinking away at 2 wound Space Marines. You're kind of likely to get 1 6 per turn, so hopefully that should guarantee some damage through. Maybe not the most enormously solid damage, can combo well with Expert Crafters or Masterful Shots, or maybe even with the Doom Psychic power, which again will give you more chance of getting those 6s to wound. For the Vor's Wrath support weapons, you can get D cannons for 70 points, 24 inches for D3 shots at Strength 12, AP-4 and Damage D6. Sorry, it's not D6 shots as I was mistakenly written there, that will be ludicrously strong indeed. The damage per points is really quite good, but they are kind of hampered by that short 24-inch range. They're perhaps more of a unit to punish enemy units that are advancing forward to you, rather than one that's actually that good for taking the fight to the enemy. Shadow Weavers for 50 points are D6 shots at strength 6, AP 0 and damage 1, and again they get that similar rule to the Night Spinner where they get AP -4 on 6s. Compared with the Night Spinner, they'll be a little bit better against 1 wound infantry, but a little bit worse against anything with 2 wounds or more. I'd say out of the two, perhaps the Night Spinner is the better choice. Either way though, I think that both of those support weapons do kind of struggle to compete with vibro cannons. They are direct line of sight shooting, but they can be really quite solid damage output when they are taken in multiples. Otherwise, in addition from those dedicated artillery support platforms, you have the Wraithseer for 170 points in the Imperial Armor Compendium. That one can be equipped with a D cannon, and it's actually really quite a good combo, as you've actually got quite a mobile platform to take that D cannon towards the enemy army. Again, it can be really quite nice with that expert crafter's trait, as you can really put the hurt on enemy heavies, even if they are hiding out of line of sight, maybe behind a midfield ruin. Finally, you've got a bit more shooting options with the Dark Reaper Tempest Launcher Exarch, and you can even take the specific Exarch power to reroll the number of shots if you want a bit more reliability out of it. It's not too bad against chewing through light and medium infantry, 2d6 shots at strength 4, AP -1 and damage 1, and also ignoring modifiers. I have not so fond memories of playing against these guys as foot guard, often losing great big chunks of a squad every turn to a few of these guys hidden at the back. For the forces of the Tyranids and the Hive Mind, we have the Hive Guard, Biovores, and some Genestealer Cult options. Hive Guard are 45 points per model and often crop up in competitive lists. Their Impaler cannons are heavy 2 36-inch weapons with strength 8, AP -2, and damage D3 that ignore cover. Honestly, these guys are very strong indeed. That profile is going to be pretty efficient against killing most things that you target it at, anything down from medium infantry all the way up to heavy tanks. On top of that, you can take a 6-strong unit that can double shoot for 2 command points, potentially getting a massive 24 of these shots from a unit that costs less than 300 points, targeting what they like. If you Hive Fleet Kronos as well, then you can even reroll 1s to hit, if you just need that little bit of extra firepower. A very competitive unit, and the 36-inch range is big enough to threaten a decent chunk of the board while remaining hidden. The other Tyranid artillery beast is the Biovore. 50 points for a model, and when it fires it has a 50-50 chance of either dealing an average of 1 mortal wound to the enemy unit, or deploying a spore mine somewhere nearby. For the damage output, 50 points for a 50-50 chance of 1 mortal wound is pretty rubbish, and that's just not really going to cut it for dealing damage. Really though, I'd say that the most use of these guys is the spore mine placement. Setting up even a single pesky spore mine nearby could be enough to move block certain big units, say things like tanks trying to move in between a couple of ruins. Definitely not a unit to spam, but 1 or 2 of these in an army list could potentially make it quite annoying for your opponent to move things around. For their cult allies, the Genestealer Cult can potentially deploy Achilles Ridge Runners with a heavy mortar. Though they're really badly balanced, I never really want to take one of those when you could take a heavy mining laser instead. The massive upgrade and damage output is just far too big to ignore for that one. Otherwise, you could think about Brood Brother heavy weapon teams for a few mortars, or just Allied Guard, though you won't be able to use the full payload upgrade on the Manticore as they can't get tank cases. Most of the other Xenos factions don't have all that much significant ignores line of sight weapons. Orks don't have all that much. One of the only ones is the Lobber on the Battle Wagon, though it's not really all that efficient when you're hitting on 5s. Though Tau do have a couple of interesting options, as they can take a bunch of smart missile systems all over the army, and potentially have quite a big hail of strength 5 missiles, a lot of which could be AP -1 with an advanced targeting system. Not the biggest threat to heavies, but could be really quite intimidating for hordes. They can also take air-bursting fragmentation projectors on their battlesuits, which are an 18-inch D6 shot, strength 4 weapon. They're quite cheap, and it's really not all that terrible damage dealing, combined with an advanced targeting system. Could be pretty good for clearing enemy units off objectives. The Relic Supernova launcher version of this is really quite interesting though. Again, it's only 18-inch range, but it goes up to a massive strength 6, AP -2 and damage 2, so most things that you do shoot with that are likely to feel it. Overall though, not an absolute ton of it dedicated ignores line of fire shooting. It more tends to be a bit more spread out and dispersed over their whole army. So finally, I thought we'd just round up by talking about my favourite choices, and these are my 2 favourite dedicated artillery platforms, and my 2 favourite mixed role units that do have a significant artillery weapon. For absolutely dedicated artillery platforms, my favourite are the Guard Manticore with full payload. It's cheap, incredibly long range, and anything that it shoots at is certainly going to feel it. The same goes for the Tyranid Hive Guard. Their main weakness is only being 36-inch range, so they might need a little bit more careful thought about where they're going to be deployed and how they're going to be screened, but potentially having 24 shots of death raining out from a place that you can't shoot is very intimidating. They are a unit that demands the opponent tries to find a way to deal with them. For the more mixed role platforms, I really like the Scorpius Disintegrators with the energy cannons. They can be strength 7 with the Mars Canticle and get some decent rerolls so they can really focus down one unit, as well as still firing a fair bit of missile and anti-infantry fire with those stubbers. And the Plague Burst Crawler is just an all-round great unit, really tough, great direct fire with those entropy cannons, and again the Plague Burst Mortar with decent AP, damage and strength is certainly going to make its impact felt. So let me know what you think about the artillery choices in 9th edition 40k, which are your favourite and why, and are there any important Ignores line of sight choices that I've glossed over in this video? I wouldn't be surprised that in the entire game there might be a few. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where I'll certainly keep the 40k videos coming pretty much every day, or just check back later for more videos. Finally, if you have been enjoying the content on the channel, I would just like to mention that I do have a Patreon page, which you can find down in the video description. Making all the content on the channel, particularly long in-depth reviews like this, does take a fair amount of time, and if you are enjoying regularly, any support is massively appreciated. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, such as seeing certain new videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next for the channel, and automatic entry to the prize giveaways, with the chance to win some really big model kits every month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support the channel, then the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.